Content warning. This video contains disturbing real-life accounts of school lockdowns, violence, and threatening situations. This content may be unsuitable for viewers under 18 years of age or those who are sensitive to fear-inducing material. If you are under 18 or sensitive to frightening content, please do not watch. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. You think you know what fear feels like. Maybe you've watched a horror movie alone at midnight, or maybe you've jumped at a loud noise in an empty parking lot. But none of that, not a single second of it, compares to the kind of fear that sets into your bones when a voice crackles over a school loudspeaker and says 4 words that change everything. This is not a drill. I've spent months collecting these accounts. Real people, real schools, real lockdowns. Some of these stories have never been shared publicly before. These are not dramatized versions, not exaggerated for entertainment. These are the experiences of students and staff who lived through some of the most terrifying moments imaginable, trapped inside the very buildings that were supposed to keep them safe. What you're about to read is going to stay with you. I want to be completely honest about that. Once you hear some of these details, you cannot unhear them. So if you're still reading, that means you're ready. Let's get into it. The last Friday before spring break. There's something about the last Friday before spring break that hits differently when you're in high school. The air feels lighter. Teachers stop pretending to care about lesson plans. Even the hallways seem to breathe easier. For 17-year-old Ryan Marsh, that particular Friday afternoon felt like the finish line was finally within reach. Ryan was sitting in 7th period AP Calculus, the last class of the day, the last class of the week, the last class before 9 glorious days of freedom. His teacher, Mr. Henderson, was the kind of educator every student secretly hopes for, relaxed, funny, and completely unbothered by rigid structure. He'd once spent an entire class period debating the greatest pizza toppings in American history with full academic seriousness. Nobody complained. That Friday, with 20 minutes left in the period and absolutely zero chance of a test, Mr. Henderson had pulled up a trivia game on the classroom's shared screen. The whole class was playing along, shouting out answers, groaning at wrong guesses, laughing too loud for a school setting. Ryan remembers the exact moment his friend Casey answered a question about a famous athletic brand's logo. He remembers the answer. He remembers the exact second the energy in the room changed, because that's when the loudspeaker clicked on. Principal Dawson's voice filled the room, and Ryan said he had never once heard that man sound rattled. In 4 years at Jefferson High, Principal Dawson had always been the voice of calm authority. He was the kind of man who seemed like nothing could shake him. But his voice that afternoon was tight, clipped, barely holding together. Attention all staff, this is not a drill. Please initiate lockdown procedures immediately. Do not allow any students to leave your classroom. Ryan said the words hit him before his brain could even process them. He described feeling a chill travel from the base of his neck all the way down both arms, not the chill you get from air conditioning, but the kind that your body produces when it senses something is genuinely, seriously wrong. Mr. Henderson, laid back, pizza debating, trivia playing Mr. Henderson, moved faster than Ryan had ever seen him move. He crossed the room in 3 strides, hit the light switch, and in the same motion began herding students toward the back corner. No jokes, no hesitation. His face had transformed into something Ryan barely recognized. This was not the teacher they knew. Everyone to the back, now, quiet, down on the floor. Go. 24. Students pressed themselves into the far corner of a darkened classroom. Someone was trembling. Ryan could feel it, the vibration moving through the cluster of bodies sitting shoulder to shoulder on the industrial tile floor. Nobody spoke. The trivia game still glowed faintly on the screen before Mr. Henderson grabbed the cord and yanked the projector dark. For 2 full minutes, nothing happened. Ryan said those 2 minutes felt longer than most hours he'd experienced in his life. The only sounds were the muffled hum of the ventilation system and the barely audible sound of someone near him trying not to cry. Then silence swallowed even that. The low electrical hum that always buzzed from the control panel mounted on the back wall of the classroom simply stopped. Not gradually, all at once. Ryan said every student in that room went rigid at the same moment because they understood immediately what that silence meant. The school had cut the power. Whatever was happening, it was serious enough that the administration had killed the electricity to the entire building. Ryan looked around in the near darkness. He could make out faces, pale, wide-eyed, trying to hold it together. A few of his classmates were gripping each other's arms. Mr. Henderson remained standing near the door, his back flat against the wall beside the frame. He wasn't looking at the students. He was listening. 3 more minutes passed. Then they heard it. It started distant, a sound from somewhere deep in the building, muffled by walls and closed doors. But it was unmistakably human, unmistakably male, and unmistakably unhinged, screaming. Not the screaming of someone in pain, not the kind of scream that comes from surprise or injury. This was something else entirely, raw, furious, and somehow deliberate. The voice was moving, getting louder, getting closer. 2 girls in the class, Ryan doesn't use their names out of respect, began to cry. He said it wasn't dramatic. They weren't wailing. They were just sitting there with tears streaming silently down their faces, shaking, and somehow that was so much worse than if they'd screamed, because it meant they felt what everyone felt, that something genuinely terrible was approaching this classroom. The screaming grew louder, and then it became words. "I will kill every single one of you, every single one." Ryan said that sentence physically stopped his heart. He described feeling the words enter his ears and land somewhere deep in his chest, like they had weight and gravity. He looked at Mr. Henderson, who had pressed himself so flat against the wall beside the door that he seemed to be trying to become part of it. The teacher made eye contact with Ryan and pressed one finger slowly to his lips. "Don't make a sound." The screaming voice was in the hallway now. They could hear every word as clearly as if the man was standing inside the room with them. And then the banging started. The metallic crash of locker doors being struck rang through the hallway like gunshots, one after another after another. The man was running his fists or his body or something along every locker as he moved, and the sound was relentless and rhythmic and absolutely terrifying. Ryan said his entire body locked up. He could not have moved if he'd wanted to. His muscles had simply stopped accepting input. One of the crying girls, the one sitting directly beside Ryan, suddenly made a sound. She screamed, just once, short, sharp. The banging in the hallway stopped. There was a single second of absolute silence. Then the classroom door handle rattled, hard, once, twice, 3 times. Then fists hit the door, open-palmed, then closed. The sound echoed off every surface in the darkened room. Students pressed further into the corner, collapsing against each other. Someone grabbed Ryan's arm. He grabbed them back. Mr. Henderson did not move from his position at the wall. "Open this door. Open it right. Now." Ryan said he started praying. He's not particularly religious, and he's honest about that. But in that moment, pressed into a corner in the dark with 23 other terrified teenagers, while a screaming man pounded on their classroom door, he prayed. He prayed the lock would hold. He prayed the door would not open. He prayed that whatever happened next, it wouldn't happen to them. The pounding continued. Then, gradually, agonizingly, it began to move away. The screaming shifted back to non-words. The crashing resumed against the lockers further down the hallway. Then it faded. Then it was gone. Nobody in that room moved. Nobody spoke. Mr. Henderson remained at the wall. 10 minutes passed. Principal Dawson's voice returned to the loudspeaker, and Ryan said hearing that voice again was like surfacing after nearly drowning. The principal explained what had happened in controlled, careful language. An individual had entered the building in a disturbed state, had assaulted the woman working the front reception desk badly enough that she fled the building in fear, and had proceeded into the school. Staff could not confirm whether the individual was carrying a weapon. Administrators and faculty had conducted a full sweep of all accessible areas. The individual could not be located. Teachers were instructed to resume class with all doors locked, and no student was to be released for any reason until further notice. The rest of that class period passed in silence. Not the easy silence of a lazy Friday, the heavy, suffocating silence of 24 people trying to process what they'd just experienced. But here's the part of this story that Ryan still cannot stop thinking about. The custodial staff working the building that evening, long after students had gone home, long after teachers had filed out, discovered a man sleeping in a storage closet near the building's rear utility corridor. The man had not left. He had hidden. He had waited. And according to what Ryan was told by people close to the school, when the custodian found him, there was something visible in the man's jacket pocket. A firearm. Whether the weapon was loaded, whether the man had intended to use it, whether he was ever identified and apprehended, Ryan says nobody in his class ever received clear answers. The story sort of dissolved into rumor and silence the way traumatic school events sometimes do, absorbed into the institution's need to move forward and appear safe and functional. What Ryan says he knows is this. For at least several hours, an armed and deeply disturbed individual was inside his school while 24 teenagers huddled in the dark 20 feet away from the hallway he was walking through. Ryan said he still thinks about that man sometimes. He doesn't feel anger, which surprised him when he first noticed it. He feels something closer to sadness. He hopes the man found his way to help. He hopes somebody, somewhere, got him the support he needed before anything worse could happen. But he also never quite feels the same way about last period Fridays anymore. 4 loud booms and a glass wall. Marcus Webb was 13 years old the day of the lockdown, in his first month of 7th grade at a mid-sized public middle school outside Columbus, Ohio. He remembers that the sky that morning had been heavy and gray, the specific shade of overcast that feels like a ceiling lowered too close to the ground. Rain had been coming and going since breakfast. It was the first lunch period. Marcus was standing near the back of the food line, surveying the options with the kind of intense strategic focus that only middle schoolers apply to cafeteria menus, when he heard it. 4 sounds, in rapid succession, loud, not subtle, not distant, not something you could talk yourself into being something harmless. 4 concussive booms that cut through the cafeteria noise like a blade through paper. Marcus's first thought? He's laughed about this since, though it wasn't funny at the time, was thunder. The sky had been threatening storms all morning. His brain reached for the most comfortable explanation and grabbed it before his instincts could offer the alternative. But the cafeteria crowd didn't think it was thunder. The screaming started immediately, not the startled shrieking of kids reacting to a loud noise, but the full-body panic of a crowd that had collectively decided something was very wrong. Trays hit the floor, chairs scraped back. Marcus said the noise of the room went from normal lunch chaos to pure animal terror in less than 3 seconds. And that shift, that specific gear change in human sound, is the thing he still can't shake years later. Campus security entered from multiple directions at once, moving with a coordinated urgency that made everything worse. Adults yelling at hundreds of kids to move, to leave their food, to get into the multi-purpose room now. A word that, in the mouth of a frightened authority figure, carries a completely different weight than it does in any other context. Marcus and his group of friends went with the crowd, pushed by the energy of the mass movement, into the gymnasium-sized multi-purpose room at the center of the building. The space was enormous, designed for school assemblies, presentations, the occasional indoor event when weather made the athletic fields unusable. It filled with students fast. The back wall of the room was made entirely of reinforced glass panels, floor to ceiling, spanning the full width of the space. On any other day, it gave the room a bright, open feeling. That afternoon, it was the first thing the adults moved to address. Marcus watched as staff members pulled the thick privacy curtains across every glass panel with a speed and seriousness that told him everything he needed to know about how dangerous the situation was. Every exit, there were 4 of them, had at least one adult standing at it. Some had 2. Nobody was leaving. Nobody was entering. The room was buzzing with whispered questions and the barely contained panic of several hundred middle schoolers trying to understand what was happening. Marcus's friend Jake, the kind of kid who had never once in his life been able to tolerate not knowing something, slipped through the crowd to the nearest adult and asked directly what was going on. He came back within 2 minutes. "You know those houses right across the street from the front of the school?" Jake said. Marcus knew them. Every kid did, a short row of residential homes visible through the chain-link fence that ran along the school's front edge. An odd feature of the neighborhood geography, the way residential streets sometimes pressed up against school properties in older American towns. "There's a guy," Jake said, lowering his voice. "He's barricaded himself inside one of them. He's threatening to hurt himself and threatening the cops. And apparently he was outside, walking around, watching kids through the fence." The cafeteria noise level in the room dropped by half as that information spread outward in whispered ripples from student cluster to student cluster. Then Jake said the second part. "He's a registered sex offender." Marcus said the air in that room changed physically when that information landed. He was 13. He was old enough to understand exactly what that phrase meant and exactly why it made everything worse. The fact that this particular man had been watching children through a fence while threatening violence. The combination of those facts created a specific species of fear that Marcus describes as different from anything he'd felt before. Not just fear for himself, fear in a much wider, harder-to-contain way. The students remained in that multi-purpose room for a full hour. 2 class periods effectively erased. Teachers moved through the crowd, attempting to maintain order, answer questions, and project a calm that nobody actually felt. When students were finally escorted out, classroom by classroom, with staff supervision, the palpable relief was almost embarrassing in its intensity. Kids who hadn't cried during the lockdown cried in the hallways as they walked back to their classes. It wasn't until later, days later in some cases, that the full context of the situation became clear to those who lived near the school. Marcus had a friend named Kayla who lived on the street adjacent to where the incident had occurred. She knew the man in question. Not well, not personally, but she knew him the way you know a neighbor you've never spoken to but whose presence registers as wrong, as off, as something you can't quite name but don't want to get closer to. Kayla told Marcus about the previous Halloween. She'd been walking the neighborhood with a group of friends, in the way that teenagers do, part trick-or-treating nostalgia, part just wanting an excuse to be outside at night. When she'd looked up at the window of that particular house and seen the man standing there, writing on the glass, she'd assumed at the time that it was Halloween decoration, fake blood, staged horror, the kind of thing some adults put real effort into during October. She'd even pointed it out to her friends. They'd laughed. They'd kept walking. It wasn't until after the incident outside the school that Kayla told Marcus what she'd actually read on that window, written in something dark and wet and unmistakable. "Don't come here. I will kill you." It had not been Halloween decoration. The man was eventually resolved out of the situation by authorities, de-escalated, taken into custody, evaluated. He did not enter the school. He did not harm any student. By every official measure, the lockdown worked the way it was supposed to work. But Marcus says he thinks about Kayla sometimes. About the Halloween night she walked past that window and laughed at what she thought was a creative decoration. About how close proximity to something genuinely dark can look, from the outside, like nothing at all. He says that's the part that scares him more than the lockdown itself. The Basement, Part 1. There's a particular kind of career trajectory that doesn't get discussed much. The one where you graduate college, find yourself staring at a job market that has very little interest in your enthusiasm, and end up back in your hometown working a job that your 22-year-old self would have greeted with complicated feelings. Daniel Ortega wasn't embarrassed about it, though. At least, that's what he told himself. He'd graduated in May from a state university with a degree in computer science and information systems, fully expecting to land something in tech within a few months. When that didn't materialize the way he'd planned, one of his former high school teachers, a computer and networking instructor named Mr. Reeves, reached out about a day part-time position at Daniel's old high school. The school needed someone with real technical knowledge to manage their server infrastructure and help the IT department stay on top of day-to-day operations. It wasn't exactly the career Daniel had pictured. But the pay was decent, the commute was 5 minutes, and Mr. Reeves had always been one of those rare teachers who felt more like a colleague than an authority figure. He'd had 3 teachers like that in high school, Mr. Reeves, Ms. Calloway, and a networking instructor named Mr. Park, and all 3 of them had gone out of their way to advocate for him during the hiring process. That meant something. So Daniel took the job. His workspace was in the school basement, a sprawling, dim, organizationally chaotic space that smelled like decades of old paper and overworked cooling systems. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Storage shelving stacked with outdated textbooks, boxes of athletic equipment that hadn't been touched since at least the previous decade, and the kind of accumulated institutional clutter that grows in any large building that's been in operation long enough. But carved into one corner of this basement was an office that Daniel describes as genuinely, unexpectedly comfortable. 3 large desks, 2 mini-fridges stocked by the occupants themselves, a flat-screen television mounted on the concrete wall, and, the crown jewel of the entire arrangement, central air conditioning. Not the struggling, groaning window unit variety. Real, powerful, consistent, cool air. A luxury that the students sweating through late September in classrooms 3 floors above would have staged a full revolt to access. Daniel shared this office with 2 co-workers, Dave, a 30-something IT infrastructure specialist who communicated primarily in dry humor and caffeine, and Gary, a network administrator in his mid-40s who had the energy of someone who had made his peace with everything and found the peace comfortable. The 3 of them had developed an easy rhythm over the weeks since Daniel started. They worked well together. The basement felt, in a strange way, like a small autonomous zone within the larger school, removed from the hallway noise and lunch period chaos above them, operating on its own quiet schedule. That was about to change. It was a Tuesday in early October. The school year was in full stride. That particular point in fall when the initial novelty of a new academic year has fully worn off and the long institutional grind has resumed its normal pace. Dave and Gary had gone upstairs to deal with some administrative paperwork, leaving Daniel alone in the basement office with his lunch. He was halfway through a sandwich when his phone rang. The caller ID showed the main office number. Daniel. The woman's voice on the other end was controlled in the specific way that people get controlled when they are working very hard not to sound panicked. We have a situation. The school is going into lockdown. Someone may have entered the building. We don't know if they're armed. Stay where you are, keep the lights off, and do not make any calls until we contact you again. She hung up before he could respond. Daniel sat in the suddenly very quiet basement office and took stock of his situation. The office was comfortable and well equipped. It was also, crucially, not particularly secure. There was no actual door to the office space, just a wide opening into the broader basement corridor. The door at the top of the basement stairs technically existed, but the lock mechanism had been broken for at least as long as Daniel had been working there. Maintenance had been notified. Nothing had happened. The broken lock had become one of those institutional facts that everyone knows about and nobody fixes. He turned off the lights in the office. Then he turned off his computer monitor. The basement went dark in a way that felt immediate and total, the kind of dark that takes a moment for your eyes to even begin to adjust to. He texted Dave, "Hey, man, school's on lockdown. You okay?" He texted Gary, "Lockdown. Where are you?" Neither of them responded. Daniel sat in the dark and waited. He could hear nothing from upstairs. The basement effectively isolated sound in both directions. He had no way of knowing what was happening in the building above him. He had no way of knowing if Dave and Gary were safe, whether they'd been told to shelter in place in a classroom, whether they even knew what was going on. He played games on his phone with the screen brightness turned all the way down. He checked the time every few minutes. 20 minutes passed, with the grinding slowness of time experienced in isolation and anxiety, each minute feeling like it was being stretched manually. Then the basement door opened. Daniel heard it clearly. The specific creak of that particular door, a sound he'd learned to recognize over weeks, of Dave and Gary coming and going throughout the day. But Dave and Gary had not responded to his texts, and nobody from the main office had told him the lockdown was over. The creak echoed through the darkened basement. Then footsteps, coming down the stairs. Daniel pushed his chair back from the desk. His mind ran the options fast. Call out? Stay silent? Move? Don't move? He had no information, no context, no way to evaluate the footsteps he was hearing as anything other than unknown. The footsteps hit the basement floor. They were moving in the direction of the office. Daniel dropped out of his chair and pressed himself under the desk. He crouched there in the dark, breathing through his nose, trying to control the sound of his own respiration. The footsteps entered the office, stopped. He could hear presence, the specific silence of another person standing in a space, breathing, existing in the same air as you. The lights did not come on. The room stayed dark. And then Daniel's phone lit up on the desk above his head with a new text message. In the complete darkness of that basement office, the soft glow of an incoming text notification was approximately as subtle as a flare gun. Daniel felt his entire body contract. He pressed himself tighter against the underside of the desk, clenching his jaw so hard it hurt, waiting for whoever was standing in that office to notice the light and respond to it. The footsteps moved toward the desk. Daniel made a decision. He launched himself out from under the desk, not gracefully, not tactically, not with any plan beyond the raw animal need to not be trapped in a corner in the dark, and came up on his feet in the middle of the office, already speaking, already begging, the words coming out before he'd consciously chosen them. "Please, please don't. Please, I'm not. Please." A hand grabbed his arm. He flinched so hard he nearly fell. "Hey, hey, it's okay. Take a breath." The voice was calm, male, not the voice Daniel had been imagining, not aggressive, not threatening, just a man in the dark telling him to breathe. Daniel stood in the darkness with his heart attempting to physically exit his chest cavity and looked at the figure holding his arm. He couldn't see much, but in the faint light that filtered down from the small ground-level window near the ceiling, he could make out the general shape of the person. A man, probably mid-40s, wearing a flannel shirt in a red and black plaid pattern, dark jeans, a cap pulled down over his forehead. "I'm just hiding," the man said quietly. "Same as you. Teacher upstairs told me to find somewhere to go. I figured down here was good." Daniel exhaled slowly. He was still shaking. He could feel his hands trembling. "What's going on up there?" he whispered. The man shifted, didn't quite answer. Instead, "Is there another exit? Down here, I mean. Besides the stairs?" Daniel pointed toward the far end of the basement. "There's a utility exit." "Yeah, around that way." Something about the interaction was snagging on a corner of Daniel's brain. The man's unwillingness to answer his question, the specific detail of asking about exits, the way his eyes kept moving, not the restless eyes of someone frightened, but the scanning eyes of someone calculating. Daniel's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen. The text was from Dave. "Dude, this is insane. Some guy with a gun shot Mr. Callahan, red shirt and hat. Whatever you do, do not come upstairs." Daniel looked up from the phone. The man was looking at him, not at the phone, at Daniel's face, reading it. Daniel ran. The basement, Part 2. The thing about running when you're terrified, and Daniel would spend a long time afterward trying to explain this to people, is that it doesn't feel like a decision. It doesn't feel like anything conscious. One moment he was standing in the dark basement looking at the man who had just looked at him, and the next moment his body was already moving toward the door. He hit the basement stairs at full speed. He took them 2 at a time, 3 at a time. He didn't count. He was operating on pure kinetic panic, the kind of total physical commitment to escape that overrides pain and fatigue and rational thought entirely. Behind him, he heard the man move. Then he heard a sound that he had never heard before in real life, a sound that he'd only ever encountered in movies and news reports and the abstract space where scary things live when they haven't happened to you yet. A gunshot. It detonated in the confined space of the basement like the world had cracked open. The sound was enormous, not just loud, but physically present, filling the entire space with concussive pressure. Daniel didn't stop. He couldn't have stopped. His body had made its decision and was executing it without any input from the part of his brain that was capable of forming coherent thoughts. He heard something strike metal in the darkness. Behind and below him, a sharp, violent ricochet that told him the bullet had missed him and hit something. A pipe, maybe. A shelving unit. He didn't look back to find out. He hit the top of the stairs and burst through the basement door into the school hallway above. What he found there was controlled chaos, the specific organized urgency of law enforcement doing its job. Police officers had stationed themselves at every exit of the building, front, rear, side corridors, and, Daniel would learn this within seconds, the basement utility exit. The hallway he emerged into had at least 4 officers visible from where he stood, weapons drawn, moving with the practiced efficiency of people trained for exactly this kind of situation. Daniel immediately dropped to his knees with his hands raised. He'd seen enough news coverage in his life to understand that emerging at a dead sprint from a basement stairwell during an active threat situation was not the moment for ambiguity about your intentions. "He's down there," Daniel managed. "Basement. He went for the utility exit," the officers responded. 2 moved toward the basement stairs. 2 moved toward radio contact. Daniel sat on the floor of his old high school hallway with his back against the wall and tried to remember how to breathe normally. The man in the red plaid shirt was apprehended at the utility exit, exactly where Daniel had directed him. He emerged from the basement door into the arms of 2 officers who had been stationed there waiting because they had been stationed at every exit, because that is the protocol, because that is why protocols exist. The man did not resist. It was over. In the days that followed, Daniel learned the details of the full situation in pieces, the way information always arrives after a traumatic event, in fragments and second-hand accounts, and careful official statements that say just enough and not quite everything. Mr. Callahan, a 10th grade history teacher who had been at the school for 11 years, the kind of educator who coached the debate team and remembered every student's name 3 years after they'd graduated, had been shot in the shoulder in the main corridor near the administrative offices. He'd survived. The surgery had gone well. He was expected to make a full recovery and return to teaching, which he did 7 weeks later. The man in the red plaid shirt had a prior relationship with Mr. Callahan. Not a school relationship, not a professional one, but something from their lives outside the institution. The exact nature of it was never publicly disclosed. The official statement said only that the 2 men had a personal dispute and that the school and its students had not been the intended target of the incident. Whatever had passed between them, whatever grievance, whatever history, whatever series of decisions had led to a Tuesday morning in a school hallway with a gun, it remained, and remains, officially private. What the staff knew, what the students knew, what Daniel knew with bone-deep certainty, was that whatever Mr. Callahan had done or not done in whatever private context existed between those 2 men, none of it could possibly have warranted what happened. None of it could have justified a gun brought into a school. None of it came close to explaining what Daniel had experienced in that basement. He submitted his resignation 2 weeks later, not because of fear, or not only because of fear. He tried to explain it to Mr. Reeves when he went to deliver the news in person because Mr. Reeves deserved a real conversation rather than an email. He said it wasn't that he couldn't go back. It was that every time he thought about the basement, about that desk, about the dark and the footsteps and the text message lighting up at exactly the wrong moment, he understood that his nervous system had filed the basement office under a category he couldn't easily uncategorize. Mr. Reeves didn't push back. He'd been in the building that day, too. He understood things that don't require words. What do 3 stories like these have in common? That's the question I kept coming back to, spending weeks with these accounts, listening to the details that people remember and the details they don't, paying attention to the specific textures of each experience. Ryan, crouched in the dark back corner of a 7th-period calculus classroom while a screaming man pounded on the door 20 feet away, said the thing he'll carry forever is the sound of his classmates crying silently. Not the screaming from the hallway, not the banging, the quiet tears of teenagers trying not to be heard. Marcus, pressed into a crowd of 7th graders in a multi-purpose room with the curtains drawn over the glass wall, said the thing that stayed with him longest wasn't the lockdown itself. It was Kayla's Halloween story. The idea that something genuinely dangerous can look completely normal from the outside, can look like decoration, can look like nothing at all. Daniel crouched under a desk in a dark basement while an armed man stood 3 feet away from him, said the thing he thinks about most isn't the gunshot. It's the text message notification, that soft glow of light in total darkness. The way one ordinary, everyday thing, a phone receiving a text, became in that specific context one of the most terrifying things he'd ever experienced. These are not stories about extraordinary circumstances. They are not stories about faraway places or unusual people. They are stories about a Friday afternoon before spring break, a rainy Tuesday during lunch, an ordinary workday in a basement office. They are stories about how quickly the scaffolding of ordinary life can become something else entirely. What happens after one thing that rarely gets discussed when people talk about school lockdowns, and people do talk about them in the abstract, in the political and policy sense, is what happens to the people who are inside them after the all-clear sounds and the police leave and the administrators send everyone home. Ryan went on spring break the following week, as planned. He spent it at his cousin's house in another state, doing the things that teenagers do on spring break. He laughed. He had a good time. And he said that approximately every 3 to 4 hours, without warning, his brain would replay the sound of that man's fist hitting the classroom door. He'd be standing at a barbecue or watching something on television and the sound would arrive, not triggered by anything, just surfacing from wherever his memory had stored it. That happened for months. It happens less now, but it still happens. Marcus said that for the rest of 7th grade, every time a lunch period started in that cafeteria, he felt something in his chest tighten involuntarily when the noise level of the room rose above a certain point. The specific combination of cafeteria sounds, chairs, voices, tray clatter, and a sudden loud noise would send his nervous system briefly back to the afternoon of the 4 booms. He learned to recognize the response, sit with it, let it pass. He got better at it, but it took a long time before a loud sound in a crowded cafeteria felt neutral again. Daniel left education entirely. He did eventually land the tech job he'd been looking for, a position at a software company in a mid-sized city 4 hours from his hometown. He's been there for 3 years. He likes the work. He likes his team. He's built a good life. He says he has never been able to hear a door creak in a dark space without feeling a specific, immediate, full-body memory of that basement. It doesn't incapacitate him. He's not looking for sympathy about it. It's just a feature of his experience now, an auditory trigger mapped permanently onto a moment of genuine terror. These are the things we don't talk about when we talk about school safety. We talk about protocols and legislation and security measures and threat assessment. We talk in aggregate and in policy. We rarely sit with the specific, individual, bodily reality of what it does to a person to experience genuine fear for their life inside a school, a place that is supposed to be defined by safety and structure and the ordinary progression of learning. Ryan, Marcus, Daniel, a high school calculus class, a middle school cafeteria, a college graduate eating lunch in a basement office. 3 separate incidents, 3 separate institutions, 3 separate decades, almost, spanning from the early 2000s to relatively recently, and 3 people who carry, in different ways and to different degrees, the weight of what happened to them in those buildings. A final thought. I want to say something directly before we close out. Every single person whose account appears in this video gave their story voluntarily and with awareness of how it would be used. They did not do it for attention. They didn't do it for sympathy. They did it And this is the thing each of them said in some form or another, because they wanted the experience to mean something beyond themselves. They wanted to contribute to a record of what these moments actually feel like from the inside, because too often we discuss them from a comfortable distance. The schools in these stories had lockdown protocols. The protocols worked, in the sense that no student was physically harmed. By the official metrics of crisis management, each of these situations was resolved successfully. And yet, if you've read this far, you already understand the gap between successfully resolved and okay, between protocol worked and everyone was fine, between what the official record says happened and what Ryan and Marcus and Daniel carry around in their nervous systems years later. That gap has a name. It doesn't always get one, but it does. And the only honest thing any of us can do with stories like these is receive them with the seriousness they deserve. Not perform shock, not use them as political ammunition, just hear them. Let them be real. Let the people who lived them have done something by sharing them. Thank you for reading to the end. It mattered that you did.